Um, my name is Sharon Day, and I am the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Task Force. And how I got to be here was in around 1987. My younger brother called me up on the phone, and he said, "It's a big A, sis. Um, I want to call mom on the three-way call, and will you be on the call?" And I told him no. I'll drive to her house. And so I went to my mother's house, and my brother called her and told her that he had AIDS. And back in 1987, if you had AIDS, that was pretty much a death sentence. You were going to die. And at the time, I was working for the state of Minnesota as the special assistant director for the Chemical Dependency Program Division. And my brother said, what are you going to do? And there was another Native woman, her name was Carol Lefevre, and she, that same year, called me up and said the same thing. I have AIDS, and what are you going to do about it? There are no services for Native people. So a number of us in the community got together, and we held some community meetings, and in my agency at the state, I hired a young woman who is working on her master's in public health to create an 8-hour curriculum and go around the state, and she did. And we expected that some Native organization would pick up the work, and nobody did. And so we formed back then it was called the Minnesota American Indian AIDS Task Force, and we hired our first staff person in 1988. And I left my job at the state to become the executive director in 1990. And it was meant for me just to be a 2-year project, and then I would go back to my job at the state. And but I never left. And this work here with people in the community has opened up for me just a way to be creative in ways that I wasn't able to be in my position at the state of Minnesota. And so here it is 25 years later. I'm still here, still working with young people. We have a theater company that's been in existence since 1990. And in fact, I ran into one of the young people that I worked with probably around 1992, and he is now publishing a book. He's won national poetry slam contests, and I have other young people that I worked with who are filmmakers today, and leaders in the community who have master's degrees in public health. And so it's been very gratifying to, I guess that's why I'm still here 25 years later.
How has your work broadened from your initial focus on AIDS in the Indian community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as I said, we began as an HIV/AIDS organization, and at that time, like I said, people were dying from AIDS complications. Sat with many people who died, and we actually had nothing to lose because people were dying, and so we developed programming that was really culturally based. So when we were writing these plays with young people, and the young person has to play a character who's gay, who's going home to die, his reservation to die, we had to teach our young people about, what are the concepts of death and dying in our community. Not what Kubler-Ross had written at that time, but what do our people think about death and dying? What do our people think is healthy sexuality? What do our people think about the creative process? And so we asked elders, and we interviewed people, and we came up with our own curriculum. And that really opened the door into not just HIV, because that doesn't happen in a vacuum, but around self-medicating, around identity issues, And then as time went by, and we were continuing to work with youth, we began to look at some of these other issues that affected their life. And so tobacco prevention became another issue. We had worked with young people for about 10 years, and we felt like we knew something about experiential education, culture-based learning. And so we started a school in 2000. We also started working with tobacco prevention, cessation. And so that opened the door into that. And our board of directors went back and met with community people and clients. And following a 2-year process, they broadened the mission from just working with HIV to working with Native people around health, wellness, and education. And the last thing they did was change the name from the Minnesota American Indian AIDS Task Force to the Indigenous Peoples Task Force. And they thought about that, and that was the name they came up with. And it was a political decision. Indigenous peoples include all people who live on what we consider to be Turtle Island. And so that would be Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And those were the indigenous peoples that we wanted to provide our services to.
If I understand right, you started with theater as the way of combating HIV/AIDS. How did you come to that idea? Mm-hmm. There are so many ways you could have gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, we knew we started off with doing outreach to the obvious people who were most affected, and that was gay and bisexual men, also lesbians, or people we call Two-Spirit, and then IV drug users. And but we also knew that many of these individuals were probably getting infected when they were teenagers, and so we needed to target some of our prevention services to youth. And at that time, I was about 37 years old, and I knew that if we were going to be effective with working with youth, they weren't going to listen to this 37-year-old, adult, right? That we had to have young people educating young people. And so the literature said that peer education worked. So we selected that as a method. We're going to train young people. But then how did they deliver that message to other people? And so we settled on theater because storytelling, and we come from a people with an oral history, which in many ways is much more accurate than the written word, because all somebody has to do is change this word or that word and changes the whole meaning of everything. But in oral traditions, if I tell a story based on something that was in pictographs that were sketched into birch bark, and I look at that and that prompts me to tell the story. But then I have my sister over here, and I have another sister over here who listen. They know that same story. And if I leave out something, at the end I ask them to make corrections, and they do. Or something that I may have left out. And so storytelling has been part of Indigenous people's culture since time began. And so storytelling, theater, was a logical process for us to use to have youth educate other youth. And not only youth, but the whole community.
And did you encounter difficulties along the way? I imagine one would, trying something new.
Yes, if you remember, this was back in the late 80s, the early 90s. This was before Magic Johnson came out as having an AIDS diagnosis, or I think Rock Hudson may have died by then. But there weren't. AIDS was this scary thing because people died, and not only that, the people who were first ill were gay men and IV drug users. Not exactly the people that everybody gravitates towards. I mean, there were many stigmas attached to it, many phobias, and when our youth would go out and do a performance, I remember one performance we did for Indian Health Service, and it was an adult who asked the youth, "Are you doing this because you're all gay, or are you doing this because you all have AIDS?" And our youth had to understand, like, how do they respond to that? And because if they said, "No, I'm not gay," then, what did it do to that? What message was that to that gay youth who was in the audience? And so they would talk about these things and figure out, like, how they're going to respond. And so how they decided to respond was, to ask the audience, if I were, would that make a difference to you? And so, at these talkbacks, it wasn't the youth so much as many times it was the adults in the room who, would raise these sort of questions that were, on the surface could be sort of just a question, but really many times they came from some, it wasn't cool to be gay, and it certainly wasn't cool to have this diagnosis that, was going to lead to death a few years down the road.
So it must have mattered a lot who your actors were. How did you find them?
Well, the first 6 youth that we worked with were a nephew, were a friend's daughter, one of our board members' daughters. They were like that. Today, the name of the theater today is Midewin, which means word, and we have a waiting list of youth who would like to participate in our programs. And so yeah, in the beginning, no. But once those youth came in, they learned acting from Spider-Woman Theater, who in that time had been in business for about 25 years, doing theater out of New York City and in Europe, and they came and worked with us. And a director from Phyllis Jane Rose from At the Foot of the Mountain Theater, which at the time was the first feminist theater, at least in this area. And they were remarkable instructors. And so when our youth would go out and perform, like I always tell people like this: if you're at a party and you tell a joke and you get the punchline right and people laugh, that kind of gives you a feeling of, oh, like, I did that really well. If you're on stage and you're acting and you make contact with your audience and they make contact with you, and there's something that's sort of this feeling that emerges that's more than just you or more than that audience. And if you have 500 of your peers telling you did a good job, that is, if you've done that, if you told that joke and it was good, but you have 500 people coming back at you with sending you, that is so uplifting. And so our youth, when they could feel that, there was one young man, his name was Richard, and he knew every line of every character in the particular play that we were doing. And he had a lot of difficulties at home. but he memorized every single line. He knew. So if we were going out to do a play and I needed somebody, he was always there. I could do that. It doesn't matter if I was playing the grandmother or the young male character. He could play any of them. You know, the little 5-year-old that was in the character, he could play the grandmother and the 5-year-old, didn't matter. He could do it. And I remember once after a performance, we were sitting and we were talking. And Richard said, well, I know when we did a good job. And I used to notice that after every performance, he would come right up to me and he would look me in the eye. And he said, I know when we did a good job when I walk up to Sharon and she has tears in her eyes. And so, you know, that's why we have a waiting list, because the youth feel a theater's immediate. You know, you can film something and it's okay and it's great and you can distribute it and you can reach a wide number of people. But theater is right now. You know, it's right now. And our performances, our stories are meant to change the hearts and the minds of people.
You mentioned at the beginning that some of the people you'd worked with early on had gone on to education and to careers. Were these partly people who'd been involved in the acting?
Oh yes, they were all one of my kids at one time and came through our programs. And since then we've expanded, and I don't get to work with kids every day anymore. But we have trained young people to work with them, and so you know it continues on. And now we have other youth programs. We have our Wave-Nagay tobacco prevention program, and you see those young people out and about. And we have our garden program. And yesterday I got to work a little bit with the young kids in the garden program. And one of the older kids from the Midewin program came over and asked me a question because she knew I was there. And she said, well, what animals sit in the 4 directions? And then there was a young one, probably 10, 11 years old, maybe not that old, sitting right next to me, and she said, it's in the south it's the eagle, in the west it's the bison, in the north it's the buffalo, and then in the east it's the eagle. And so the older youth said to me, there's 2 eagles? I said, yes. One is a bald eagle, and in the south it's a golden eagle, Gnu. And she was like, oh. And then she went back to her group, and then, you know, there was some sharing. The little kids I was working with were painting their ceramic pot that they're going to plant stuff in and take home. And the older kids were doing something else. And then in the afternoon, at the end of the day, the older kids came over and shared their sort of what they were working on, the posters they were working on. And then the little kids shared their pots and the images that they had painted on their pots with the older group. So it was really great.
How has your work changed from the beginning?
Yeah.
It sounds like you were very much involved with the theater work and act performances and able to encourage people directly in the beginning. How has stuff work changed for you?
Well, so now, like the work that I was able to do directly with youth back then, and other programs, our adults in our HIV program, the case management and the housing. And now I do that with staff. So it's the same thing, right? Motivating, encouraging, getting them to take on new skills. In 2011, I led a water walk from Gulfport, Mississippi to Lake Superior, and so I was gone for 42 days. And the staff were all very panicky. You know, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? And I was always available by phone or email, but they had to step up and take on some things that they sort of depended on me for. The board stepped in and took over some of the financial management while I was gone. And so now, if I leave to do a water walk and I'm gone for 10 days, piece of cake. Because they've stepped up and they've learned new things and realized that they can do these things with or without me.
So, have the satisfactions of having a staff sort of made up for losing the satisfaction of working hands-on direct with the kids?
I mean, it's. I still love to work with the kids when I get the opportunity to, which isn't that often. But the practices that we've developed, really transfer to other groups. And so, I just came back from the Cuyahoga River Water Walk, which is a 4-day walk in Cleveland, Ohio. But the practices that I've helped to create for the walk, they're really the same. And so it's teaching, like other groups, how to care for the water, care for the land, care for the environment. And when they do that, they're caring for each other. What they learn is what we know, but it just gets reinforced. As humans, we are water. At conception, we're about 85-90% water. And come into the world, we're about 75% water. And so really teaching people how we treat the water is how we treat ourselves, how we're going to treat other people. And if we could treat the water with love, care, kindness, respect, and honesty, that would be how we would treat ourselves and treat other human beings. And so, these practices that we've developed over time, really, it doesn't matter whether I'm working with kids or other adults or staff, or it is basically the same. That if we want to save, this planet that we live on, and have that available for future generations, it really goes back to right now. What are we doing right now? And how do we honor ourselves and everything around us?
How did you come to this work with water and this concern with the environment? It seems, at first glance, although maybe not to you, to be kind of a distance from the original mission of your organization and the original work you were doing.
Well, I'm Ojibwe, and from the Boys Fort band. I grew up north and grew up, when I was a little kid, our refrigerator was the spring behind the house. And I'm also Midewin, which is the spiritual practice of people here in Indigenous people here in the Midwest and Northeast and part of this land. And in our teachings, women are responsible to take care of the water. So this has always been part of my life. But because we're in the crisis we are in 1998 we were called to help to save a spring. And so that's just become incorporated into what we do. I believe that in 1998 it was the first time that we took that sort of spiritual work out of our ceremonial work and placed it into like a geopolitical setting. And I believe that it was necessary because of the crisis we're in right now. I mean, today, in July 2015, North America's on fire. the planet is really there. There are so many fires in Canada and out west right now, and all of this has to do with climate change, right? And so the other day it was really difficult to even breathe here because of so much smoke that was captured in the air after the rain and the fog. And so we are really in a time where we really must take some action if we want to continue the sort of life that we have on the planet. And the earth has cleansed herself before. We all know about the great floods and the ice age, and now we're the earth is in many places is many areas of the United States itself, have been in a drought for years. We're talking like 14, 15, almost 2 decades. And if you remember a few years ago, the Everglades, like a place that's like moisture, right? Swamp was on fire. And so these things just continue, and we need to take some action.
What do you see as the possible kind of contribution out of Native spirituality, out of your own beliefs and practices? How do you see that helping to solve this problem? What can you add that you take to be important?
Well, I think that as Indigenous people, we're fairly close to our to the land, and I say that because even as a child, like I said, the spring was our refrigerator, right? You took your butter and you put it in a plastic container and you put it down in the spring. The spring was cold and it kept it cold. We still gather a lot of our medicines. We harvest wild rice, and we gather some of our food, and so we're just a little bit closer to the natural environment than most people are today, unless you're farming. Most people today, where does your water come from? You turn on a tap, there it is. You want to heat your home in the winter, you go to the thermostat, you turn it on. And so we're removed from our water, our natural environment. We just happen to be still closer to that. And so, and our ceremonies are fairly intact. So you have, our spiritual values, which are, kindness, respect, generosity, to be courageous. They're still fairly intact, and they're not just something that it's a way of living. Whereas other folks are somewhat removed in that. And every time our president says, "God bless America," well, really, what does that mean? And what does that mean in relationship to the rest of the world? So I think we have something to share with the environmental movement. It's not just about the environment as this, this thing that's going to take care of us, or the place that we live and what do we need to save it. It's really understanding that, the earth is our mother. We are the water. All the water we have now is all the water we're ever going to have. And how do we take care of that? And so how do you make like an offering for that? How do you have that connection? And I think that's what we bring to this sort of environmental table, that and social justice, because all of these things are intertwined, and you can't like heal this piece right here without healing the whole. And that's, I believe, what we bring to this movement.
Thank you.